In the grand halls of 18th century European courts, marriages were less about love and more about politics, alliances, and power. But when the marriage is between two people with incompatible personalities, you get chaos. Such was the fate of Caroline of Brunswick and George, Prince of Wales, later King George IV of England. Their union, arranged for the purpose of solidifying alliances and royal lineage, was one of the most infamous in British history. From the very beginning, their marriage was doomed, a catastrophic blend of political maneuvering and public scandal that ended in a very unexpected way. This is what happened. In the late 18th century, the British monarchy found itself at a crossroads. It was a time when the relations between Britain and the smaller German states were fragile. It was also this time that the Prince of Wales, George, the eldest son of King George III, was living a life of excess, accumulating vast debts through gambling, lavish spending, and womanizing. He was notorious for his love affairs, particularly with his Catholic mistress Maria Fitzherbert, whom he had secretly and illegally married in 1785. This scandalous relationship caused deep concern among the royal family and parliament, who were desperate for the prince to marry a Protestant princess and secure the royal succession. It was at this delicate moment that Caroline of Brunswick entered the picture. Caroline was the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick and Princess Augusta, the sister of King George III. Her royal lineage made her a prime candidate for the future Queen of England. She will help end the scandalous relationship and calm the mind of everyone. More importantly, a marriage between George and Caroline would help repair fractured relations between Britain and the smaller German states. On paper, it was a match made in heaven, politically expedient and beneficial to both countries. But while the marriage may have seemed ideal to the political powers that be, the personal realities were far more complex. Caroline, who was described by many as lively and boisterous, had been raised in the less refined court of Brunswick, far from the decorum and rigid etiquette of the British court. She was known for her eccentricities, her loud and brash behavior, and her disregard for formal propriety. George, on the other hand, was overly difficult to please, vain, and obsessed with appearances. So from the beginning, it was clear that the pair would not be a harmonious match. Despite George's personal reluctance to marry Caroline, he understood the political necessity of the union. So in April 1795, after negotiations were completed, Caroline of Brunswick arrived in England to meet her future husband. By this time, George was 32 years old and deeply entrenched in his lavish lifestyle. But from the moment the two met, the seeds of disaster were sown. Their first encounter was legendary in the annals of royal misfortune. George, who had been drinking heavily in anticipation of the meeting, took one look at Caroline and was immediately repulsed. His reaction was as swift as it was cruel. He turned to a friend and muttered, "Harris, I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." Caroline was equally unimpressed. In a letter to a confidant, she described George as very fat and nothing as handsome as his portrait. She found him cold, distant, and unappealing. The initial distaste between them was mutual, and it only grew worse as they spent more time together. Despite their personal feelings, the marriage went ahead on April 8, 1795, in a grand ceremony at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. The union was full of royal ceremony and tradition, but beneath the surface, both bride and groom were deeply unhappy. During the ceremony, George was reportedly so drunk that he could barely stand, and he had to be propped up by his attendants. According to Caroline, on their wedding night, the prince was so intoxicated that he passed out in the fireplace and spent most of the night there. The next morning, George informed Caroline that he wanted nothing more to do with her, stating bluntly that they would live separate lives. However, something beautiful came out of that night they spent together. Within weeks, Caroline became pregnant. In January 1796, she gave birth to their only child, Princess Charlotte of Wales. Charlotte's birth did nothing to improve the relationship between her parents, even though it was a joyous moment. In fact, George grew even more distant. He had already returned to his previous lifestyle, spending his time with his mistress, Maria Fitzherbert, and avoiding Caroline at all costs. For Caroline, the situation was intolerable. She had come to England expecting to fulfill the role of queen-in-waiting, but instead, she found herself isolated, unloved, and publicly humiliated by her husband's open infidelities. The court, which had long been loyal to George, treated Caroline with cold indifference, further deepening her sense of alienation. In response, Caroline adopted a defiant attitude, living as she pleased and refusing to adhere to the strict codes of royal protocol. This defiance only widened the chasm between her and George. By 1796, George had written to Caroline, formally requesting a separation. In a letter dripping with resentment, he made it clear that they would no longer live together, though Caroline would retain custody of their daughter, Princess Charlotte. Following their separation, Caroline retreated from the royal court and established her own household at Blackheath on the outskirts of London. There, she surrounded herself with a motley group of friends and servants, many of whom were considered beneath her station. Caroline's behavior became increasingly erratic and unconventional, with rumors of flirtations and possible affairs swirling around her. While some of these stories were likely exaggerated, they did significant damage to her reputation. But because of George's lavish spending and how he treats his royal wife, Caroline began to emerge as a sympathetic figure, particularly among the lower classes. To many, she was the wronged wife, cast aside by an immoral and self-indulgent prince. Caroline's growing popularity only served to deepen George's resentment toward her. By 1814, the situation had become untenable. George, now the Prince Regent due to his father's mental illness, was determined to rid himself of Caroline once and for all. With the consent of the British government, Caroline was offered a generous financial settlement on the condition that she leave England and live abroad. Tired of the constant scrutiny and humiliation, Caroline accepted the offer and departed for the continent, where she embarked on a life of semi-exile. For the next several years, Caroline lived in Europe, traveling from country to country and continuing her unconventional lifestyle. She was frequently accompanied by her Italian servant, Bartolomeo Pergami, with whom she was rumored to be having an affair. In 1820, King George III died, and the Prince Regent ascended to the throne as King George IV. With his accession, Caroline automatically became Queen Consort, a title that George was desperate to deny her. Upon hearing of George III's death, Caroline immediately returned to England, determined to claim her rightful place as queen. Her return set the stage for one of the most sensational public trials in British history. George, furious at the prospect of Caroline becoming queen, sought to have her marriage annulled and her title stripped. He and his advisors launched a formal investigation into her conduct during her time abroad, hoping to gather evidence of infidelity that would justify a divorce. This investigation led to the infamous Pains and Penalties Bill of 1820, which sought to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve her marriage to George. The trial was a public spectacle with deep details of Caroline's alleged affairs presented before Parliament. Witnesses were brought forward to testify about her supposed misconduct, but despite the scandalous nature of the accusations, the public overwhelmingly supported Caroline. Crowds gathered outside Parliament shouting slogans in her favor and denouncing George as a tyrant. Ultimately, the bill failed, and Caroline retained her title as queen. However, her victory was short-lived. In 1821, as George prepared for his coronation, Caroline attempted to attend the ceremony but was forcibly barred from entering Westminster Abbey. Humiliated and heartbroken, she fell ill shortly afterward and died on August 7, 1821, just weeks after the coronation. For Caroline, her marriage to George was a source of immense suffering. In the eyes of many, she was the wronged queen, unjustly treated by an uncaring and decadent monarchy. For George, the marriage was a source of constant frustration and humiliation, a political misstep that haunted him throughout his reign. Their story remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of arranged marriages in royal courts, where personal happiness was often sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Don't forget, like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching.